in terms
of my time as well. Thank you very much, Professor Richard. Thank you very much, Professor Tim and Christine, for this incredible opportunity to learn so much. I'll talk about consumer vulnerability and hypervulnerability under Brazilian law. As you may know, consumer defense, consumer protection is a fundamental right in Brazilian Constitution. We have it in Article 5, 32 and Article 170 as a principle of our economic order. Therefore, our Consumer Defense Code was established due to provision on our Constitution as well. And it has as a principle of our national policy for consumer relations, the recognition of consumers' vulnerability in the consumer market. This is very interesting. Professor Lima Marques states or pinpoints four types of consumer vulnerability under Brazilian law: technical, legal, factual, and informational. We must as well consider the income influence factor. If we divide the whole population of Brazil in 4 levels of income, most Brazilians would be in level 3. This graphic I won't read, but it may suggest how most of Brazilian population may live. Unfortunately, we have part of our population under the extremely poverty line, and these conditions of life sometimes make huge influences on access to information, access to education, and several other resources needed for quality of life. So in practice, recognizing consumers' vulnerability in consumer markets, it means that we only use the reference of an average, well-informed individual in civil relations, B2B, and consumer is always a degree below that, a degree below of this Brooks Brothers version of the legal subject indicated by Professor Finneman today. A consumer is always vulnerable, would probably not read or not understand all information, could even be a bit careless. Recently, on July of this year, we had an important reform on our Consumer Defense Code, and now it states another degree of protection for consumers. A note is important that in Brazilian law, a legal entity may as well be a consumer, be considered a consumer. But this reform of our legislation now establishes increased level of protection for individual consumers. This article, I think, may interest you. It is now forbidden in the offer of credit to consumer. So this reform relates to over-indebtedness, wherever advertising or not to harass or pressure consumer to contact with the supplier for a product, service, or credit, especially if a consumer is elderly, illiterate, ill, or in a state of aggravated vulnerability, or in if the contract involves a premium. This state of aggravated vulnerability is the hypervulnerability. Our justice have been measuring for several years, have the doctrine had recognized this hypervulnerability as a concept in our law. In some cases, people have several levels of vulnerability. In post-modernity, the pluralism is one of our main characteristics. So many people may be in some more elevated degree of need, of weaknesses. And since all consumers are vulnerable, it was necessary to state that some of us are even more vulnerable. This vulnerability may be aggravated, which corresponds to hypervulnerability. So also recently, on August of this year, Mercosur, which is the southern common market here, country. I lost the chat, but I translated very poor translation into English, but I translated from Portuguese into English. Maybe a few of you might be interested. This resolution was published, was already incorporated in Argentinian law and will be incorporated in Brazilian law, hopefully until next year. And it states that we consider consumers in a hypervulnerability situation when they have an aggravated vulnerability, disadvantage, weakness due to their age, physical or mental conditions, social, economic, ethnic, cultural circumstances that cause special difficulties to fully exercise their rights. This presumption, and I especially like this part, this presumption of hypervulnerability is not absolute and must be met in the specific case depending on the circumstances of the person, time, and place. Article 2 elencates several other causes for hypervulnerability, being a child or adolescent, elderly, person with disabilities, a migrant, tourists. A tourist is hypervulnerable under this resolution, belonging to indigenous communities, being in a situation of vulnerability, economic vulnerability, or social vulnerability. This is very interesting, belong to a single parent family with children who are minors or have disabilities, having serious health problems, among others. Reflecting about Christine's big questions at the beginning of this conference, who is vulnerable and why? In Brazil, all consumers are vulnerable, and in Mercosur, we have pinpoint some groups who are possibly have an aggravated vulnerability. The legal framework in Brazilian consumer law has tools to consider these differences that distinguish each of us and to provide effective remedies for the abuse of good faith that allows a contracting party to take advantage of the vulnerability of another party through damaging its economic or non-economic interests. We can inverse the burden of proof. It's very usual in our legal practice in order to help this consumer who is in a situation of vulnerability. It's also possible that we have a common obstacle. Christine asked us, and I believe that a common obstacle might be enforcement. I like the presumption of vulnerability is not absolute and it must be met in specific case. We are aware of the concern on how to escape the uncertainty of interpretation and application in the process of the law. Especially my main field of study is consumers' time, how we can protect consumers' time. In this area, the consumer's level of vulnerability determines the conduct we may fairly demand of a supplier. So, for example, I can wait longer for a reply of my healthcare plan than a patient who is currently living with stage 4 cancer. I practice in my practice, private practice of law. I have a client who was a newborn and he had to do a brain surgery. It was not Laís looking for a dermatologist in downtown London. It was a newborn looking for a very specific physician with very complex skills, and his parents asked for the health plan insurance for an indication of who could do the surgery, and they did not receive a response, a proper response. The answer was, you should look on our website. But as you may imagine, in Curitiba, not many physicians could do such a procedure, and therefore we are looking for a recognition of this increased vulnerability in this case. So consumers' aggravated vulnerability impose or increase suppliers' legal duties towards them. There are several achievements resulting from the living law of the courts, from case law in Brazil that could be pointed out. I unfortunately don't have the time for that. But the main concern of the law becomes the legitimacy of the solution, if it's fair or not in that particular case, considering that characteristics of that particular consumer. However, depending on the case law, we fall into the individual transaction, and today Professor Finneman inspired us to a broader perspective. But I'm glad that, as I see in Brazilian consumer law, even though we have several difficulties on our country, but the judiciary, the judges, they're very sensible, they're very concerned about looking for a legitimate solution for a case, recognizing that being vulnerable is a part of human condition, that suppliers have all the data, all the information they need to consider these particularities of each individual in a consumer relation with an asymmetry of information, and they should therefore work to proper answer or attend to meet some specific standards needed in the particular case. So I hope with these slides to have shown you why we searched in Brazil for reconstructed this idea of hypervulnerability, because all consumers are vulnerable, and we identify that among them we have some groups or people who are living with an aggravated vulnerability, which may be permanent or transitory, and depending on the circumstances. So I try to meet my time, and I would like to thank you very much again for this opportunity to learn with you all today.